The temple to Hera on Samos, for example, was 3 times the size of the Parthenon. I mean, gigantic temples to Hera.
Wow, I had no
Would
idea.
you really, right? Would you really build a temple that size if you hated her?
The very talented and very prolific Natalie Haynes is at it again. This time she looks at the ancient Greek goddesses and asks, why are they the way they are? And should we like them? Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today's episode is with Natalie Haynes, author of several books, including Pandora's Jar, Stone Blind, and 1,000 Ships, which was a national bestseller and shortlisted for the 2020 Women's Prize for Fiction. Natalie is a comedian, as well as a broadcaster for the BBC, and has written for The Times, The Independent, The Guardian, and The Observer. Today we'll talk about her most recent book, Divine Might. But before we begin, a quick thank you to our Classical Wisdom Society members who make this podcast possible. If you would like to become a member and help support the classics, as well as enjoy our free newsletter, please go to classicalwisdom.substack.com. Now, is Hera as bad as she seems, or should we have a bit more sympathy for the queen of the gods? And I was just saying, it's always amazing to me how prolific you are. I mean, by the time I've got a podcast ready to go out, you've got another book. It's amazing.
Someone has to be.
Yeah. So I wanted to kind of compare a little bit to begin with your new book, Divine Might. It's sort of like a follow-up from Pandora's Jar. So
Yes.
Why did you feel the need for a sequel? What kind of inspired you for this next book?
Well, I mean, it was a nice problem to have, but it was something that we hadn't expected, truthfully, is that Pandora would be so popular. It just didn't occur to anybody that a book about women in Greek myth would be read with such enthusiasm on both sides of the Atlantic and you know, a stack of other countries too. And I'd always said, when I was writing Pandora, that I would do a second volume if they wanted, and they were like, yeah, Natalie, we'll see how it goes. And then, because I kind of hate the idea, it's very, you know, it's one of those things, it's one of those sort of unspoken misogynist assumptions that I think the people who make don't necessarily realize is misogynistic, where they're like, okay, so you've written a book about women in Greek myth, so why would you write another? And you're like, because women are half of people. so there's loads of them. So having picked 10 for Pandora, there were still, you know, there were lots of alternatives I could have chosen for, you know, all those chapters. I just picked 10 that I felt like writing about, but I could equally have just picked a different 10, and, you know, it would have still been a fun book for me, I hope also for the reader. And so I was sort of thinking that I would do like a second volume of women, and then when it came to it, I thought, oh, maybe it would be cool to do goddesses instead. And I felt like there was some kind of gray area, because obviously I'd done Helen of Sparta and Pandora, and she kind of gets deified, sort of, you know, post-mortem. And obviously Pandora comes from the god, and I was like, well, I think it's okay. So I thought it would be an interesting thing to write about, particularly the Olympian goddesses and a few more besides. But again, I could have easily picked 8 other goddesses for this book, and, you know, it was not arbitrary, but it was, you know, they were hard choices. I didn't make them with any sense that I was doing the only ones I could do. Could easily have been other ones. And I guess I thought it would feel kind of similar when I was writing it to Pandora, but actually I found out really quite quickly something that I just hadn't noticed before, which is that the source material for goddesses was quite different from the source material for mortal women. That mortal women tended to have been reworked in loads of different media, you know, narratives and things, in recent history. So you get lots of different stories. You know, I was finding stories of Helen of Troy / Sparta and everything from Agatha Christie to, you know, Star Trek. It wasn't hard at all. But actually, you've got a lot fewer examples of goddesses appearing in those kinds of narrative storytelling than I expected. You get lots of visual arts. And particularly with, you know, Aphrodite, you get, of course, a lot of visual arts, because the Renaissance was just full of men who wanted to paint naked women, and, you know, it was easier to paint a pagan goddess than a Christian one, I suppose. If well, clearly don't have any Christian goddesses, but anyway, you see my point. You couldn't easily paint nude women if you were sticking within a Christian context than you could if you went to Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is where, you know, obviously lots of artists drew inspiration. So yeah, I thought it would be a similar sort of book to write, and in some ways it was, emotionally it was, but in terms of the material it was actually quite different. So there's probably more, maybe more visual arts, and film was sort of a fun bonus when I got to Artemis, but I really couldn't find film for, you know, someone like Hestia. It didn't come up.
Oh, we need a Hestia movie. I think that would be wonderful.
I so agree. Yeah.
You know, so it's really interesting. I mean, as you just said, that this kind of a difference in the shift has been from sort of mortals to gods, goddesses. Do you think there's been a more or less just treatment of the deities sort of over the years than the mortals that you discussed in Pandora's jar?
Well, that largely depends on the years. Certainly in the early years of Christianity, and by early years I mean it in a classicist sense, like 3rd, 4th century CE, rather than, you know, sort of 5 years. I mean centuries at a time. And you do get examples of goddesses from you know, the Greco-Roman pantheon, who the statues have been physically vandalized. You know, crucifixes have been chiseled into the face of Artemis or Aphrodite, and that's quite hard to see. You know, it looks like it comes from a place of terrible anger to me. Generally, I think defacing someone's face seems, you know, whether they're, for want of a better phrase, real or imagined, doesn't seem to me to make it still seems to come from a place of huge rage. So yes, I mean, early on in the shift from polytheism to Christianity, then Christian goddesses take a real polytheistic goddesses take a real kicking from the early Christian church, I'm afraid, quite literally, I'm sure, on occasion. And then through later years, it's been more neglect, I think, than sort of misogyny, in a way which is kind of boring, actually, to sort of have to deal with. You're like, oh, really? So I felt very strongly that the sort of narratives that we now got about the goddess Hera, for example, were really keen to kind of play up how spiteful she is and how vengeful she is. And, you know, those things are undeniably true, but it's also undeniably true that she was worshipped with incredible vigor in the ancient world. And it just didn't seem very likely to me that people went to a temple really eagerly. And, you know, the temple to Hera on Samos, for example, was 3 times the size of the Parthenon. I mean, gigantic temples to Hera.
Wow, I had no idea.
Would you really build a temple that size if you hated her, or if you thought she was just a goddess to be feared? I mean, maybe, but I don't think so. I think there must be, you know, Hera is really representative of her constituency in the ancient world, which is married women. And in her case, you know, she is married to the ultimate patriarch, a god who will not be faithful to her and makes no attempt to try, who keeps secrets from her routinely, and who uses coercive control techniques against her, and who doesn't hesitate to threaten her with violence, and, you know, has used actual violence against her. You know, we find that out really early on in the Iliad, where Hephaestus, Hera's son, says to her, you know, we can't openly go against what Zeus wants, because, you know, he'll hurt you, and he's done it before, and when I tried to stop him, he hurt me. So this is an incredibly abusive figure, an abusive husband and father figure. And although not technically Hephaestus's father, I acknowledge, but, you know, operating in a fatherly role. And so it seemed to me that we were focusing really on the wrong thing, which is, you know, Hera is a total bitch to whoever Zeus has raped or seduced. And that really seemed to me only a small part of the narrative. The first bit would be, sorry, did you just say her husband repeatedly rapes people? And then the second part of the narrative that I felt we were missing was, what else can she do? You know, she is stuck in a relationship which, although, you know, we might see it as a relationship you'd want to leave, in terms of divine power, that's not an option that she's got. Zeus is much more powerful than any other god or goddess, really. So she can't just walk out. And they're immortal. She's stuck in this relationship forever. It's not like he's just going to die. And so once I started to think in those terms, I was sort of thinking, well, you don't want to necessarily excuse that she's incredibly vindictive to some characters from, the absolutely innocent, like Io or someone like that, who she persecutes with such viciousness. It is really quite hard to read. But other times, I've always read the Iliad thinking, why is she so mean? Why is she so mean to the Trojans? But of course, I'm not Greek, and if I'd been Greek, hearing the Iliad performed or reading the Iliad, I might well have thought, it's great that this goddess, who looks after married women, is so determined to get all these husbands home to their wives. And, yes, of course, if you're Trojan, then it still really sucks, but you're not, you're Greek. So to them, she's a much more powerful and in a positive way deity. And so I was trying to sort of unpick my prejudices and unpick the prejudices that I'd sort of grown up with at the same time, I guess. I was trying to make sure that I'd got a sense of why these goddesses might have been important to the people who, did build huge temples to them. And sometimes these have been really recently sort of attributed. So somewhere like Paestum, that's in southern Italy, Magna Graecia, as the Greeks would have once made it. There are three gigantic temples there, one to Athene, and then two that were variously attributed to other gods, including Poseidon. The Greek name for Paestum was Poseidonia. But actually now it seems from the offerings that were found there, it seems that two of the three gigantic temples that survived to us from Paestum were dedicated to Hera. So, she was hugely popular. It's like, you can't just ignore that, or you can, because obviously scholars have done for a while, but I thought it would be more interesting not to.
Yeah, well, I love that you took on Hera. I mean, and it is amazing, as you say, we have to sort of look at ourselves and kind of deconstruct why we think these ways and if they are fair. But as you're mentioning the kind of attributes of both Hera and Zeus, I mean, why did the ancients sort of craft such immoral and often unlikable gods? And I mean, I think this is something that we sometimes can't relate to as much, because our sort of modern pantheons are usually like an all-knowing, all-seeing, all-kind, all-powerful god.
Yeah, although often not very kind gods, often gods that demand all kinds of terrible things, because, these are deities where the sacred texts tended to be written, hundreds or thousands of years ago, and often the cultural mores of the time and place in which those sacred texts were composed is very, very, they're very different from our own. So obviously we have an interest in ameliorating those parts of those religious texts for religions which are still practiced today, which we don't have with something like, the Olympian gods. We just look at them as a historical example. But the short answer, I think, is this is a question that the Greeks asked themselves, in the Platonic dialogue, the Euthyphro. This question comes up. It's like, well, how do we decide what's good behavior, what is godly behavior or pious behavior? And the Euthyphro, Socrates' interlocutor, says, well, it's behavior it's things that the gods love. And Socrates says, oh, okay, so which way around is it? Do the gods love the things because they're good, or are the things good because the gods love them? What is it? And we just sort of accept that the divine attachment to something makes it good. But then, of course, the problem arises, which you have with polytheism, is, well, what happens when they love opposite things? And the Trojan War, of course, is the example that you can always use, because you have gods fighting tooth and nail on opposite sides, and that does make things really difficult. And so are the Greeks right because Hera loves them, or are the Trojans right because Ares supports them or Apollo supports them? And the answer is, I'm not completely sure what you're supposed to think. My feeling is that for ancient societies, if you have a scientific world, or for the most part pre-scientific world, then the idea that you'd have entirely benevolent gods doesn't seem very realistic. Because truthfully, would you need a benevolent god of earthquakes, or would you need a god who explains what happens when your house crashes down and your family is lost? You know, if Poseidon is a nice god, then how do you process it when something terrible happens and, you know, your children are shipwrecked on their way home? It's just unthinkable. So I think because there are so many disastrous potentialities in the world and very little scientific ability to explain them, you know, how do you know who's going to get struck by lightning? You don't. So you'd better make an offering to Zeus, you know. And the same obviously with earthquakes and shipwrecks and things like that. So I think because the natural world is so terrifying, you end up with gods who are also terrifying. And that, I think, is why you have gods like Apollo and Artemis who protect the young, Apollo young boys and Artemis young girls, but sometimes they just take their lives. Because how else would you explain? I mean, infant mortality in the Bronze Age would have been so roughly a third of people didn't make it to adulthood. A third. People didn't love their children less in those days than they do now. So you would need to think that you could try and impose some control, that if you made the right offerings, that perhaps your child would be safe, because you'd know statistically that the chances weren't ferociously strong for your kids to make it to adulthood. So I think the world is cruel. And for a long time, a lot of it was more inexplicable. A lot of it is still inexplicable. And I think that's why you end up with gods who, even if they seem to us immoral, offer a kind of explanation for a world that is amoral. You know, earthquakes don't choose who dies in them, they just happen. And that's a very hard thing to accept if you live somewhere where there are a lot of earthquakes, I guess.
Yeah, and I think historically, I mean, there were more earthquakes too, so people just had to deal with them a lot more. With regards to the kind of goddesses versus the gods, I mean, were the goddesses, as a general rule, portrayed as more immoral or unjust? Or, I mean,
no, I don't think so. Probably around the same. I mean, it's difficult because these are obviously our ways of looking at their behavior, and it's hard to think that the Greeks would have seen them in the same terms. I don't know. You know, when we look at the beginning of the Iliad, where Apollo he responds to prayers from his priest to deliver plague to the Greeks because they behaved badly and taken Chryseis and refused to return her to her father, Apollo's priest. And so to us, you know, that's sort of collective punishment. It looks unethical and horrible. But to the Greeks, I suspect it didn't look like collective punishment at all. It looked like, you know, I mean, awful, because obviously it's the Greeks who get hit. But I guess it probably looked like, you know, we should know better than to insult a god. We should know better than to insult his priest. So what looks to us like an unethical decision, afflicting an entire camp of men with plague, might have looked to them like an ethical one, you know, maintaining social order because they hadn't correctly responded and respected a priest.
so with regards to the representation of the goddesses, you know, you kind of mentioned in the book, of course, that these are reflections of men, that are all of the goddesses sort of made by men, or some kind of made by women? Is there any?
I mean, it's really hard for us to know. And the worst of it is that when we do have examples of goddesses that are worshipped largely by women, we know almost nothing about the worship because men can't tell us, and we don't have any writing that survives to us by women, or very, very, very little. So what you get is these tantalizing glimpses where, like, Pausanias will say, oh, there's this statue of Hera and she's holding a pomegranate, but obviously it's forbidden to say anything more about pomegranates. And we, reading this, are like, what? Are you kidding me? How bad can pomegranates be? But of course, as you know, pomegranates are connected to Demeter and Persephone, so they're connected to the worship at Eleusis, the Eleusinian mysteries, as we tend to call them. And those religious practices have men involved in them. We know that Demeter, you know, trains up Triptolemus and Callias and a couple of others, because it's in the Homeric hymn, I think. But we know that it's mostly probably worshipped by women. And we don't know, because Pausanias isn't allowed to go along to the worship, and even if he was, he wouldn't be allowed to tell us, because it's, you know, blasphemous to report back. So we're like, oh mate, can you not tell us one thing? You know, we've got the most extraordinary, you know, one of the most really hard for us to kind of like really believe things is that Artemis has really small children, girls, as her priestesses, or, you know, involved in her worship at a place called Brauron, which is modern day Verona in Greece, not too far from Athens. And if you read the play Lysistrata, or Lysistrata, as I should say, because this is American now, and we pronounce it differently for reasons entirely unclear, then the chorus in that say they served as bears at Brauron, bears, B-E-A-R, bears at Brauron, when they were, I think, 7 years old or a little bit older. And this is obviously a category of child priestess. Did they wear, you know, bear skins? Did they wear, I don't know. I don't know why they're called bears. And if you look at little statuettes that are found or have been found from Brauron, the little girls look much younger than 7. You know, they look sort of 4, you know, really tiny kids. And you're like, well, how could they really? But, you know, you're going to wait a long time before, you know, Plato or Pausanias or somebody is going to start writing to you about what small girls were doing as priestesses. It's just not their area. So not only do we have this sense that gods are, you know, largely defined on male terms, and therefore goddesses are largely defined on male terms, but also on the occasions when we have things that are just worshipped by women, it's really, really hard to find out what's going on, because men literally don't know. The people who could write didn't have the information that we want. So, you know, when do we find out about things like the worship of, you know, Hestia, or in Rome, Vesta? You know, we know a reasonable amount about the Vestal virgins. Fantastic. You know, what is it we know? We know about the ones who don't keep their vows of chastity and get walled up. But yeah, oh, great, okay. Whereas, you know, the actual practices of the Vestals, you know, it took 10 years to learn them, and then you practice them for 10 years, and then you spent 10 years teaching them to the next gen. That sounds complicated, whatever it is, but I can't tell you what it is, because who knows? You know, they had to keep a sacred flame alight, but that can't have been all of it, not least because, you know, the temples to Vesta burned down over and over again. So obviously they weren't completely expert at keeping an eternal flame alight, or perhaps slightly too alight. But yeah, difficult either way.
They must have needed more than 10 years to learn how to light the fire.
You think, yeah. So, you know, what could it be? You're like, oh, this sounds fascinating, but yeah, it's maddening. Those moments where you can see a sort of glimpse at a thing and you're like, ah, and the contradictions are really, you know, sometimes they're intended, of course, in a work. So we have, you know, in Euripides' Iphigenia among the Taurians, Iphigenia is a priestess of Artemis at this point, and she is bemoaning her lot at the start of the play, because she doesn't like having to make human sacrifices, and that's her job. And she considers this a sign of being in this sort of terrible barbarian territory, that she has to make human sacrifices. And, you know, good news, it's a tragedy with a happy ending. She doesn't accidentally sacrifice her own brother Orestes when he turns up. But we all kind of gloss over, Iphigenia just doesn't ever mention the fact that she is in this predicament as a priestess in of Artemis in this distant land, because her own father tried to humanly sacrifice her to Artemis at Aulis, so that the Greeks could get a fair wind to sail to Troy. And she's substituted at the last minute by the goddess herself with a deer, so that she survives, and she's sort of spirited away to be at Tauris to be a priestess. And it's like, well, what is the difference between the Taurians' human sacrifice and the Greeks' human sacrifice? The only thing that's different is that Artemis stepped in and saved her life. But she feels really aggrieved that she's in this sort of barbarian land that's not at all Greek in its values. And yet, you know, she has first-hand experience of the idea that the Greeks would cheerfully sacrifice a young girl if they thought it would help them. So it's a conundrum and a half. Yeah.
So, I mean, you're mentioning that it's so hard to find information about the goddesses and the rituals. So what sources kind of did you find the most helpful?
Going through the Homeric hymns, which, you know, I read them before, but I hadn't read them with anything like the same closeness that I did this time. And so, you know, this is sort of a they're probably not by Homer. Homer probably, as you know, isn't one person anyway, so let's, you know, not worry about all of that side of things. But these are early poems which describe narratives about gods and goddesses that otherwise we just might not know. And some of them are really long. You know, the Homeric hymn to Demeter tells the whole story of Demeter and Persephone. It's beautiful, heartbreaking, and wonderful. And the manuscript was lost literally for thousands of years. So it was only found a few hundred years ago, having been thought lost since antiquity. So we're incredibly lucky to have it. Every version of this hymn that you ever read comes from this single manuscript that was found. There's no other source for it. So we're really, you know, like normally classicists are sort of weeping over lost text, but this is one we were so lucky was found. And so I used them a lot. Of course, I used Homer. Of course, I used the tragedies. I never want to not be writing about Euripides or Aeschylus on any given day. And certainly with some of the more kind of strange or early gods or goddesses like the Furies, you know, Aeschylus was the most fantastic source, because obviously the third play of the Oresteia, the Eumenides, is they are the starring role in that. So, you know, I had a really wonderful time going through all of those, but also Ovid's Metamorphoses. You know, I was rereading a chunk of the book the other week for an interview, and I was suddenly really surprised to see how much of it I'd translated. I was like, that actually should take quite a while. So yeah, no, there is a lot of Greek and Latin sources, but then I would get so far and then I'd be like, you know, I think now is probably the time, if we're going to talk about Artemis and, you know, a goddess with a bow and arrows and things. It's like, I'm not going to not talk about Katniss Everdeen if we're talking about a girl with a bow and arrows. I'm not going to not be writing about the Hunger Games now. So I kind of got to, you know, pick things from all over the place, as is always the way with my nonfiction books, and actually also with my novels. I'm a magpie for this sort of stuff.
Now, I love that you just mentioned the Hunger Games, and it's something that I really enjoy in all of your books. You do this so often. You kind of bring in references that are, you know, movies and cartoons, things that like people live in the modern world. But what do you think about these sort of deviations from the originals? What do they say about?
No such thing as an original. I'm always fine with it, because, you know, these myths gradually evolve over basically 2,000 years. Ancient Greece is roughly 2,000 years long, as far as we are from Julius Caesar. And it's incredibly wide. You know, the Greek speaking or the Greek known world was huge. So you've got this enormous period of time and this enormous geographical spread. And these myths emerge all over the place. And so you will get what seem like kind of competing versions, where, you know, is Aphrodite especially fond of this island or that island? You know, both in all our sources, here and here, or, you know, this particular place. There's such a sense that a particular location, you know, they want to make this story their own, and so they build their temple to their goddess. And, you know, it's important to therefore have a bit of mythos that situates her here, of course. So, you know, you want there to be, you know, a reason for why the Muses might be having, you know, bathing in a spring near where you live, because you know, you might want to be singing and dancing, and then you'd like to feel like divine inspiration was really nearby. So you can really see why this would be called, you know, the Muses Spring or something. And so there is a real sense of ownership. And so yeah, I tend to see it as a sort of noble tradition which continues. You know, it began so early. Aeschylus calls his plays slices from the banquet of Homer, and of course he changes the story. You know, most obviously his version of Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon when Agamemnon returns from Troy. In Homer, it's Clytemnestra's boyfriend who does that. So really quickly, you know, that you can see that there are just divergent versions of these stories always. And so, yeah, I don't worry at all when you can do a lot to a Greek myth before it kind of collapses under its weight. You can make it boring or bad, of course, but you won't damage the, you know, earlier versions of the story. And as I say, it's so hard for us, because I think we always want to think that the version that we read as a child is the original version. And often the version that we read as a child, of course, was a sort of, you know, 20th century mishmash of things that, you know, seemed okay to the author at the time. And our values have changed since then, and their values were miles different from ancient Greeks or ancient Romans. So you know, there really isn't an original version. So yeah, I just don't worry about it. When people say, oh, how do you feel about Percy Jackson, and they kind of cower, expecting me to say, he doesn't at all live in New York, this is outrageous. Like, well, no, obviously you can do whatever you like with the story. They're really great books that make loads of kids like reading and caring about Greek myth. Why wouldn't I be in favor of Percy Jackson? It's like, seriously, there are bigger things I could be upset about than whether there is or isn't a labyrinth under the earth. Like, I'm good with him. He can create whatever he wants.
Yeah, you're like big picture people.
You know, a little bit, yeah.
No, and I think I mean I'm with you. I think that I like to remind people, for instance, that like Medea wasn't always the horrible person until
That's right.
Euripides came along, and I mean I think it's always important to respect the fact that there can be so many different versions. But I guess it's interesting to me, what does the different versions say about the individuals and the culture at the time? Like, what
absolutely,
are these
it's
differences?
incredibly revealing. Yeah, myth is a mirror. It doesn't just reflect the time that the myth is set, it reflects the time that the myth is retold and recreated. So every myth has multiple timelines in it: the Bronze Age, or earlier the Heroic Age, or earlier the Divine Age, when these stories are playing out, and then the time when these stories are being written. So when Hesiod is telling us, or Pausanias is telling us about something, then if this is the gods, then this is before people, so really early in terms of history. And then to Hesiod, we're probably the 7th century BCE, when Ovid is retelling things that he finds in Hesiod and plenty of other sources besides. That's the 1st century BCE into the 1st century CE. If you're reading a translation in English rather than Ovid in Latin, then whenever that translation is written, that's a whole other timeline. And all these different levels of interpretation are coming in one on top of another on top of another. So by the time we get it, we've got a really different picture, not because anyone was being inaccurate or not trying, but because everybody belongs to the time and place that they belong to, and you can't just suspend that. So you do get these incredible kind of images of and also they're place specific as well as time specific. So to us, our most frequent encounters with Medea are the Euripides play, for sure, because it's performed really often. But if you went to, for example, somewhere further east, near the Black Sea, somewhere like that, you would find lots of people still call their children Medea. Ludmila Ulitskaya's novel Medea and Her Children, for example, it reveals that if essentially she's a very, very brainy, thoughtful woman. This isn't an insult in some parts of the world. So
yeah,
to us it is, but that's not the version of the story that survives. For lots of people, Medea is a brilliant sorceress, or a genius magic worker of her time. So to those people, she's not a villain. Why should she be?
I just recently spent quite a bit of time in Georgia, actually, and I was very pro Medea, and that seeing her as this princess from Colchi is a completely different angle.
Right.
But yeah, she's incredibly resourceful and intelligent. I mean,
yeah,
Jason wouldn't have been able to do anything without her help. I mean, come on,
literally nothing. Yeah, he's
nothing.
a lump, I'm afraid. Yeah, there
absolutely useless.
More and less useless Greek heroes, but yeah, you've got to have really Jason and Perseus right up there for ones who, if women didn't basically do everything for them, would just be sitting on a log wishing for a story.
Yep, there's a lesson in there.
Yeah, there is.
Now I'm a big Sappho fan. I actually did a children's book on Sappho about the brother's poem, and so I love that you kind of made a few points about her, but one of which was, why is it that becoming a muse or a deity was actually kind of seen as a slight?
Well, it is, to me. I think it's one of those ways in which women are both raised up and slapped down at the same time. And there's there are more obvious versions of it, like Penelope. Penelope is such a good wife. She's like the perfect wife. No other wife comes close to being as good as her. Do you know who's terrible? All the wives except Penelope. Those steps are all really small, but nobody seems to struggle to go from one to the next, and it's really frustrating. And Sappho is another example. The idea that Sappho was the 10th muse is one that stretches back to antiquity. And it kind of annoys me. It's always kind of annoyed me, because you have these lists of, you know, great poets, and Sappho is always the only woman on these lists of lyric poets alongside, you know, Alcaeus or Alcmaeon or whoever. It feels to me like you're doing two things when you say, oh, she's a muse, she's the 10th muse. She's not the 9th poet, she's the 10th muse. You're saying women don't belong on lists of great poets at all, because, you know, even when there's one there, the first thing you want to do is take her off it. And it looks like praise. Oh, well, she's basically a goddess. But is it? Because what you do then, of course, is deny her endeavors. You know, oh, well, if you're a goddess, then it's just easy. You know, anyone can write brilliant poetry if they're a goddess. We don't sit here praising the muses for writing great poetry. We just expect it of them because they're muses. And it reminded me most pertinently when I was writing that of thinking how people used to respond when Serena and Venus Williams were playing tennis at their absolute, you know, I mean, I hesitate to say at their absolute high point, because you vaguely feel like they could both come back and win a Grand Slam now. But, you know, people would say, oh, well, you know, but they're so much better than everyone else. They can just basically turn up and they'll win. And you think, well, I hear what you're saying. That's incredibly insulting, because these are top of their game sportswomen who train day in, day out to be as mighty as they are. And then you basically say, oh, they're superhuman, so it doesn't matter. It's like, well, I'm sure no one minds being compared to a goddess favorably, but it's kind of an insult. You're denying their hard work and just saying it's somehow some, you know, divine bestowal. And so that's what irritates me about it. It's those 2 points. Firstly, that you're basically robbing her of her identity as a human being and poet. And secondly, that you're essentially saying women don't belong on lists of great people who are great at things. If you know, by some mysterious chance a woman is good at something, we should immediately remove her from the category and redefine it. You know, I've got a little bit of a problem with that.
Yeah, well, I think we should put Sappho on all the lists. Top of the list.
Yeah, so Sappho, great poet, is a much more worthwhile piece of praise, I think, than Sappho, basically a goddess.
Yeah,
it just troubles me.
She's more poetess than poetess.
There you go.
To use a Sappho superlative. Yeah. Now, I love that you kind of are dedicated to showing different sides and perspectives of these ancient goddesses and deities and myths. And you've already talked about a bit about Hera, which I think was a great one to start with because she's so complicated. But I'd love to hear a little bit of the other side of Demeter, because I feel like everybody loves her, right? Or
I mean, I do. I know there is pushback against her from a certain kind of really unexcited. It's one of these things where you go, did I miss a memo? How are we against the angry mother who refuses to let her daughter be, you know, abandoned for all eternity? Oh, okay. So, but I am very much pro her, because I think female anger is something that we are so conditioned to be frightened of and disapprove of, that when we see it, sometimes we kind of don't know how to process this, and so we just turn away. But Demeter's anger is what saves her daughter from an eternity of absolutely wretched forced marriage, you know, having been both kidnapped and trafficked. I find it a really difficult story, because I know there are lots of people want it to be romantic, and I really understand that. It's a much nicer story if it is romantic. But, you know, Persephone is kidnapped by her uncle. She is trafficked to the underworld. She is, you know, the Homeric hymn is absolutely unambiguous in its language. She is unwilling. It's against her will. He does it by force. She is screaming and crying. You know, her age isn't in question, or her youth, I suppose I should say, because she's immortal, isn't in question. She's described right at the start of the poem as pied Zeus, and she's playing the way a child plays, because she's a child, and her uncle and father collaborate, they conspire so that she can be kidnapped and trafficked to the underworld. She screams the whole time she's being carried above the surface of the earth, and until she goes underground, when she realizes there's no point because no one will hear her. And her mother hears that cry, and she will never stop until she finds what's happened and brings her daughter back. And, you know, there might be other stories about goddesses showing more Power, I suppose, maybe, but it's hard to think of one. You know, Demeter is ignored. She's sidelined by the king of the heavens and the king of the underworld. It doesn't get much more comprehensive than that. And she still wins at least a partial reprieve for her daughter by just refusing to quit. You know, she withdraws from Olympus. She withdraws from any kind of life with the other goddesses. She exhibits all the symptoms of mourning, which we can still see people do today. She stops bathing, she stops eating and drinking. You know, she doesn't speak. You know, she is devastated. She's bereaved. And because of her love for her daughter, when she finds out from Helios, from the sun god, that it's Hades who has taken her, you know, she could just accept that Hades and Zeus are much more powerful than her, and this is it. And she doesn't. She creates a famine that lasts over a year in order to force their hands, because everybody will die. And, you know, that works out really well briefly for Hades, but really badly for Zeus, who doesn't get any sacrifices made to him if no one's alive to do it. And she maintains this pressure until Hades is forced by Zeus to give Persephone back. And of course, he still employs vicious trickery and violence against Persephone by force feeding her, in the Homeric hymn at least, by force feeding her pomegranate seeds to keep her chained part of the year to the underworld. But it's because of Demeter's flat out refusal to accept the power of these much more powerful deities that Persephone has any kind of reprieve at all. And I find her story incredibly moving, incredibly beautiful. You know, it's a story which has been told and retold by contemporary poets, and particularly contemporary female poets. I think because, as the late Irish poet Evan Boland said, you can come into the story anywhere. You know, when you first encounter it, you come in, you know, maybe at Persephone's age as a young girl, and gradually, you know, you stop being this kind of tragic heroine figure, and you become the woman who simply won't hear the word no anymore. Zeus sends everybody to try and reason with Demeter. He sends every god he can think of to go and ask her to come back to Olympus, and her answer is always the same, that she won't return until she sets eyes on her daughter again. And, you know, I think there are worse ways to be than Demeter.
I'm always awed by like the power she has to just stop everything, you know, and it's just it's a beautiful testament to the mother's love. Now,
and it's really important. I used it as the dedication for this book, which is dedicated to both of my parents, but to my mum, it says, who would give Demeter a run for her money. And that is true, you know. And I guess I'm loath to prioritize maternal love too hard. I feel like it, you know, there's always the possibility that you say, oh, only mothers love this way. And I think a lot of people are capable of really profound love. But I think Demeter's love is something absolutely glorious and monomaniacal, and I wholeheartedly approve of it.
Now you're always so generous with your time, so I'll finish up with a last question, because you're always doing so much. What's your next project? What should we be waiting for?
Well, the new series of my podcast, Natalie Haynes Stands Up for the Classics, becomes available from the 28th of November. So you get series 9, that is now. Series 10 I'll be making in the first half of next year, but I think you won't get it until the second half of next year. But I will have done it, I promise. And I'm starting work on a new novel, which is Medea. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of, I know, there's going to be a lot of difficult, I know, I am too. It's 2021, I was last writing fiction, because obviously through 22 and into the beginning of this year, I was writing nonfiction. So it's been a while. It's, you know, it feels like a really long time to me, 2 years almost. So I feel very much like it's been waiting for me.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm excited. Thank you again, as always. And I'll put links to Divine Might, which was excellent, enjoyable. And I think for all of our goddess-loving readers and listeners, they will enjoy it thoroughly.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.